The heavy, protruding Habsburg jaw wasn't just a facial feature, it was the mark of a genetic curse. Obsessed with purity, the House of Habsburg committed slow suicide through centuries of inbreeding. They locked their genetics in a fortress, only to breed a lineage of monsters. But the full horror was revealed in 1700, when the royal surgeon sliced open the body of King Charles II. There was not a single drop of blood. Instead, he found a brain liquefied by water, a single black testicle withered like a prune, and a heart the size of a peppercorn. This was not the body of a man. It was the biological debris of 200 years of incest. But before the rot, there was glory. The poison started at the very summit. Emperor Charles V. In the portraits painted by Titian, he stands in full steel armor, a lance in his hand, the master of Europe and the Americas. He looks invincible, but he championed the fatal philosophy, Bella Gerantali tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry. He believed that to keep the empire powerful, the Habsburg blood must remain pure. He married his own cousin. He ordered his descendants to marry their nieces and uncles. He wanted to build a fortress of genetics. Instead, he built a prison. He did not know that with every wedding, he was tightening a noose around the neck of his own dynasty. The poison started at the top with the emperor, and it trickled down through the generations, growing more toxic with every birth. The decay moved swiftly from the body to the mind. It passed through Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. History has dismissed her as a hysterical woman, a footnote in the grand saga of Spanish conquest. But Joanna is the most important person in this story. She is patient zero. She is the carrier who brought the seed of insanity into the Habsburg bloodline, a seed that would germinate and mutate for the next 2 centuries. Joanna was the daughter of the powerful Isabella of Castile. She was intelligent, educated, and talented, but deep within her DNA lay a predatory beast. We now know that the mental instability plaguing her likely stems from her grandmother, Isabella of Portugal, a woman who spent her final years in a state of transient amnesia, hallucinations, and screaming at the ghosts of Arevalo Castle. That genetic code, the predisposition for schizophrenia and severe melancholia, lay in wait inside Joanna. This genetic bomb was triggered in September 1506. The death of her husband, Philip the Handsome, was the iron key that unlocked her madness forever. Philip died suddenly at the age of 28, likely from typhoid fever, though whispers of poison circulated through the court like a draft in a tomb. For a normal wife, this would be a tragedy. For Joanna, whose mental state was already fracturing under the weight of genetic predisposition and relentless emotional abuse, it was an apocalypse. She did not merely grieve, she shattered. The immediate aftermath of the death revealed the terrifying nature of her attachment. It was an addiction so potent that it completely bypassed the natural human revulsion to death. When Philip breathed his last, Joanna refused to leave the bedside. She sat in a catatonic silence, dry-eyed and unmoving, watching the color drain from the face of the man who had tormented her for years. The court physicians and morticians arrived to prepare the body, a gruesome process in the 16th century involving the removal of organs and the stuffing of the body cavity with lime, herbs, and spices to delay the inevitable putrefaction. Joanna watched every cut, every stitch with a hawk-like intensity. This was not the vigil of a pious widow. It was the guarding of a possession. What followed is one of the most macabre episodes in the history of European royalty. Instead of allowing a swift burial, Joanna decided that Philip must be interred in Granada, a journey of hundreds of miles. She organized a funeral cortege that looked less like a royal procession and more like a parade of the damned. It was a sprawling, somber caravan of armed guards, chanting Carthusian monks, and in the center a heavy lead-lined coffin drawn by 4 black horses. Joanna decreed that a woman who had lost the son of her soul had no business seeing the light of day. Therefore, they would only travel at night. For months, the court moved through the pitch-black Spanish wilderness, guided only by the flickering orange light of torches. The silence of the plains was broken only by the rhythmic chanting of the monks and the creaking of the hearse wheels. But the sensory reality was impossible to ignore. The smell. Despite the lead lining and the embalming herbs, the biological reality of death began to assert itself. Philip's body was decomposing. A sweet, cloying stench of rot leaked from the wagon. Yet Joanna rode close to the coffin, breathing in the air of decay as if it were perfume, completely detached from the physical horror unfolding just inches away. The depth of her madness was fully revealed near the village of Torquemada. Upon stopping at a roadside convent, Joanna realized with a jolt of paranoid horror that it was populated by nuns, by women. In her fractured reality, she did not see brides of Christ. She saw rivals who might try to seduce her husband's corpse. She flew into a rage, ordering the exhausted party to drag the heavy coffin out into the open fields, into the biting wind of the winter night. It was there, in the middle of a desolate field, that she ordered the coffin to be opened. This scene is the defining image of the Habsburg legacy. The Queen of Castile, heavily pregnant, standing in the mud, demanding to see the face of a man who had been dead for weeks. The courtiers, terrified and repulsed, pried off the lid. The lime had failed to halt the decomposition. The face of Philip the Handsome was unrecognizable. The gases of putrefaction had bloated the features. The skin was slipping from the bone. It was a sight that would make a hardened soldier vomit. But Joanna did not recoil. Witnesses reported with shuddering horror that she leaned in and caressed the dead face. She leaned down and kissed his cold, decaying feet. This act was not love. It was a pathological refusal to accept reality. Her father, King Ferdinand, seeing the political opportunity in his daughter's obvious derangement, finally intervened. He took control, buried the body, and ordered Joanna to be taken to the palace of Tordesillas. It sounds regal, doesn't it? A palace. But for Joanna, Tordesillas was a tomb for the living. In 1509, the doors closed on her. She would remain there for 46 years. That is nearly 17,000 nights in the dark. Her jailer was the Marquise of Denaya, a sycophant appointed by her father and kept in place by her son, Charles V. His orders were simple: keep the queen alive, but keep her hidden. She was confined to a set of rooms where the windows were deliberately bricked up or covered with heavy tapestries. Light was the enemy. Her father and son wanted her to exist in a perpetual artificial twilight. In that darkness, Joanna's mind began to eat itself. The sensory deprivation was absolute. No sunlight, no fresh air, just the sound of her own breathing and the scratching of rats in the walls. Hygiene became a weapon. There were periods where Joanna, paralyzed by catatonic depression, refused to bathe. Instead of helping her, her jailers let her rot. Accounts describe the rightful Queen of Spain sleeping on the floor, surrounded by her own waste, her skin covered in sores, her hair matted into a filthy nest. When she stopped at eating, a desperate attempt to exert control over her own body, the Marquise of Denia wrote to her son, Charles V, asking for permission to use force. Charles, the man with the heavy jaw and the cold heart, gave his blessing. They utilized the premica, a torture device used by the Inquisition to force open the mouths of heretics. They pried her jaws apart and poured nutrient broths down her throat while she gagged and struggled. This was not medical care. This was assault. The treatments for her condition were barbaric. Because she screamed at invisible tormentors and heard voices, the Catholic hierarchy saw a woman possessed by the devil. They deprived her of the sacraments, telling her that her soul was too blackened to receive God's grace. This, for a devout Catholic woman, was psychological torture worse than physical pain. Her son, Charles V, visited her occasionally. These visits were not out of love, they were inspections. He would come to Tordesillas dressed in his imperial finery and stand over the mother he had imprisoned. He saw the filth, he saw the madness in her eyes, and he did nothing. He needed her to remain la loca. Her madness was the legitimacy of his rule. For 46 years, the woman who brought the Habsburgs to Spain rotted in a dark room. This environment of absolute stress and trauma concentrated the bad blood. It ensured that the genetic defects she carried were amplified by trauma. And while she lay dying in the dark, the poison she carried was already flowing through the veins of her children and grandchildren. The madness did not end with Joanna. It skipped a generation and mutated. If Joanna the Mad was the ghost haunting the Habsburg attic, her great-grandson, Don Carlos, was the monster living in the basement. With Joanna, the damage was largely confined to her own mind. She hurt herself. She mourned. She screamed in the dark. But with Don Carlos, the genetic rot broke out of the internal world and began to inflict physical violence on reality. He represents a terrifying escalation in the family's pathology. He was the first clear warning shot that nature was firing at the Habsburgs, a warning that said, "Stop, or the next one will be worse." They did not stop, and Carlos was the result. The tragedy of his conception was a matter of simple, brutal math. His father was the iron-willed King Philip II, the most powerful man on earth, a man who ruled an empire where the sun never set. His mother was Maria Manuela of Portugal. On paper, it was a perfect political alliance. In biology, it was a disaster. Philip and Maria were not just cousins. They were double first cousins. This means they shared all four grandparents. Biologically speaking, they were genetically closer than a brother and sister. When they combined their DNA to create an heir, they didn't widen the gene pool. They collapsed it. They stacked identical recessive genes on top of each other, creating a genetic tunnel with no exit. Carlos was born in 1545, and from the moment he took his first breath, it was obvious that something had gone terribly wrong. He was not the golden prince the empire had prayed for. He was a physically lopsided creature. He was born with a hunched back and shoulders of uneven height, giving him a permanent, lurking posture. His left leg was significantly shorter than his right, forcing him into a dragging, erratic limp that unsettled anyone who watched him walk. His head was disproportionately large for his spindly body, and his speech was delayed. He did not speak a coherent word until he was 5 years old, and even then, he spoke with a wet, struggling lisp, his tongue too large for his mouth, the classic Habsburg deformity beginning to assert itself. But if his body was a wreck, his mind was a torture chamber. As Carlos grew from a silent child into a teenager, it became clear that the wiring in his brain was fundamentally crossed. He did not possess the capacity for empathy. The part of the human brain that regulates impulse, that understands the pain of others, seemed to be entirely missing. In its place was a cold, reptilian curiosity about suffering. He didn't just lack compassion, he found joy in destruction. This wasn't the madness of his great-grandmother Joanna, which was rooted in grief and delusion. This was something darker. This was psychopathy. His early years were marked by incidents that were hushed up by the palace, but whispered about in every tavern in Madrid. The Prince of Asturias, the heir to the throne, enjoyed roasting animals alive. There are verified accounts of him catching rabbits, not to eat or to hunt for sport, but to roast them slowly over fires while they were still breathing, watching them thrash and scream with a detached scientific fascination. This was not the mischief of a boy. It was the training ground of a sadist. The violence escalated as he got older and physically stronger. The royal stables became his playground of cruelty. One afternoon, in a fit of inexplicable rage, or perhaps simply boredom, he descended into the stables where the prized royal horses were kept. These were magnificent creatures worth fortunes, symbols of Spanish power. Carlos took a knife and slashed the tendons of 20 horses. He didn't kill them instantly, he hamstrung them. He wanted to see the great beasts collapse, to watch them panic and flail as their legs gave way. He blinded several others. When the stable masters found the carnage, they found a prince who showed no remorse, only a blank, heavy-jawed stare. But the most infamous story, the one that confirms the complete degradation of his character, is the incident of the shoemaker. It is a story that illustrates the terrifying combination of absolute power and absolute madness. A court shoemaker had been commissioned to make a new pair of leather boots for the prince. When the boots arrived, Carlos tried them on. They were tight. Perhaps his uneven legs had swollen, or perhaps the leather was stiff. For a normal person, this is an annoyance. For Carlos, it was a capital offense. His rage was instantaneous and disproportionate. He screamed for the shoemaker to be brought before him. When the terrified craftsman arrived, trembling and bowing, apologizing for the mistake, Carlos did not accept the apology. He ordered his guards to seize the man. He then ordered the boots to be chopped into small pieces. But he didn't stop there. He ordered the leather pieces to be stewed in a pot of boiling water until they were a soggy, rubbery mess. Then, with the guards holding the shoemaker down at gunpoint, Carlos forced the man to eat his own work. He watched as the man choked, gagged, and struggled to swallow the hot, chemical-soaked leather. He threatened to have the man executed if he didn't finish every scrap. This wasn't punishment. This was torture. It was a scene of grotesque gluttony and dominance. The prince sat there, his uneven shoulders hunched, his jaw jutting out, watching a man destroy his own digestive tract with a pair of boots. This moment terrified the Spanish court more than any war or plague. They realized then that the future king of Spain was not just physically frail, he was a monster. Philip II, his father, was a man of extreme discipline, a bureaucrat king who spent his life reading papers and managing the details of an empire. He watched his son with a growing cold horror. He tried to educate him, sending him to the University of Alcalá, hoping that study in the company of other young nobles, including Don John of Austria and Alexander Farnese, would civilize him. It failed. Carlos could not learn. His mind was too scattered, too prone to violent outbursts. He would attack servants with knives for minor infractions. He once tried to force a housemaid out of a window because she splashed water on his clothes. He assaulted the Duke of Alba, one of Spain's most terrifying generals, trying to stab him in a public corridor because he felt disrespected. The bad blood was boiling over. The biology of the Habsburgs was clashing with the reality of ruling a nation. You cannot have a king who eats rabbits alive and forces men to swallow boots. The tragedy of Don Carlos is that he was a victim of his genes, yes, but he was also a victimizer of everyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. He was a biological glitch that had been given absolute power, As his physical and mental condition deteriorated, the whispers in the court turned into a deafening roar of conspiracy. Carlos began to become paranoid. He believed his father hated him, which was true, though Philip viewed it as a duty to the state rather than personal malice. Carlos began to sleep with weapons under his pillow. He installed a complex system of locks on his door that could be operated from his bed. He began to talk of fleeing to the Netherlands to join the Protestant rebels fighting against his father. This was the final straw. Treason could not be tolerated even from a son, especially from a son who was broken. The stage was set for the final tragic confrontation between the father who demanded perfection and the son who was the embodiment of failure. The monster had grown too big for the palace. The prototype had failed its quality control test. And Philip II, a man who loved the state more than his own flesh, began to realize that for the empire to survive, his son might have to die. But before the death, there would come the final descent into madness, a descent triggered by a fall down a flight of stairs that would require the doctors to drill a hole into the prince's skull. If the mind of Don Carlos was already a fractured landscape of cruelty and erratic impulse, the events of April 1562 would take a sledgehammer to what little stability remained. The catastrophe did not happen on a battlefield or in a grand duel. It happened in the dark, dank stairwell of a university dormitory in Alcalá de Henares. The Prince of Asturias, 17 years old and driven by the restless, predatory energy that defined his youth, was chasing a servant girl. It was a sordid, undignified pursuit, a moment of lust that would alter the course of European history. In his haste, his deformed legs betrayed him. He slipped. Carlos tumbled down the steep stone steps, his body flailing in the dark, until his head struck the heavy wooden door at the bottom with a sickening wet crack. He was found unconscious, bleeding from a wound that seemed at first superficially manageable. But in the 16th century, the line between an injury and a death sentence was microscopically thin. Within days, the wound turned septic. The infection, fed by the filth of the age and the weakness of his immune system, began to devour him. His head swelled to monstrous proportions, the edema so severe that his eyelids were forced shut, blinding him. His face turned a deep, angry purple, burning with a fever that made him rave in tongues. The infection was eating its way through the bone, pressing inexorably against the membrane of the brain. The heir to the world was rotting from the neck up. King Philip II, terrified of losing his only son, summoned the greatest medical minds of the Renaissance, including the legendary anatomist Andreas Vesalius. They gathered around the dying boy's bed, a grim council of black-robed men smelling of vinegar and camphor. They realized that poultices and bloodletting were useless. The pressure inside the skull was killing him. To save the life of the prince, they had to perform the most terrifying procedure in the medieval medical arsenal, trepanation. The surgery was a descent into a medieval nightmare. There was no anesthesia. There was no sterile field. There was only raw physical restraint and the cold steel of the surgeon's tools. 4 strong men were ordered to hold the screaming prince down on the blood-soaked sheets. Vesalius took a trephine, a serrated cylindrical drill designed to bore through bone, and placed it against the exposed, infected skull of the boy. Slowly, grindingly, the doctor began to turn the handle. The sound of metal scraping against calcium filled the small stone room, drowning out the prayers of the priests. The room was filled with the acrid smoke of friction, the copper tang of fresh blood, and the overwhelming stench of necrotic pus being released from the cavity. As the drill broke through the inner table of the skull, a fountain of pressurized infection burst forth. The doctors cleaned the wound, scraping away the dead bone and the corrupted tissue, while the prince writhed in an agony that is impossible for the modern mind to comprehend. They were literally carving the madness out of his head, or so they hoped. But science alone was not enough for the desperate Habsburgs. In a moment that perfectly encapsulates the grotesque duality of the era, where pioneering surgery walked hand in hand with dark superstition, the doctors ordered a necromantic intervention. They sent messengers to a local Franciscan convent to exhume the body of Fray Diego de Alcala, a holy man who had been dead for a century. They dragged the withered, mummified corpse out of its crypt. The body was leathery, skeletal, and preserved by the dry Spanish air. They brought this relic into the sick room. In a scene of macabre intimacy, they placed the 100-year-old corpse into the bed beside the 17-year-old prince. They took the mummy's cold, desiccated hand and placed it directly onto the open, oozing wound in Carlos's skull. It was a tableau of horror. The living, bleeding monster lying cheek to jowl with the silent dead, a fusion of biology and mysticism. They believed the holiness of the corpse would draw the poison out of the living brain. Remarkably, impossibly, Carlos survived. Whether it was the skill of Vesalius's drill or the shock of the mummy's touch, the fever broke. But the boy who woke up in that bed was not the same boy who had fallen down the stairs. The physical trauma to his frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, judgment, and empathy, was catastrophic and permanent. The glitch in his DNA had been exacerbated by blunt force trauma. The sadism that had been a quirk of his personality became his defining trait. The prototype monster was now fully unleashed. His paranoia metastasized into a total detachment from reality. He became convinced that his father, Philip II, was not just a king, but a sorcerer who was stealing his vitality to live forever. Carlos began to wander the palace corridors like a phantom, muttering about assassination plots. The violence turned inward and outward simultaneously. He attacked his own servants with little provocation. In a fit of rage, he assaulted the Duke of Alba, Spain's most feared general, attempting to stab him in a public corridor because he felt a slight disrespect. He made erratic, treasonous plans to flee to the Netherlands, intending to join the Protestant rebels fighting against his father. He was no longer just a biological failure. He was a clear and present danger to the stability of the entire Catholic world. The climax of this tragedy occurred on the night of January 18th, 1568. It is one of the most chilling scenes in Spanish history, a father deciding to destroy his son to save his house. King Philip II, a man who famously buried his emotions under a mask of icy stoicism, donned a suit of armor over his nightclothes. Accompanied by 5 armed members of the Council of State and 12 guards carrying torches, he marched to his son's bedroom in the middle of the night. The sound of their heavy boots on the stone floor echoed like the drums of an execution squad. They found Carlos sleeping in a fortress of his own making. The prince, terrified of being murdered in his sleep, had installed a complex system of levers and pulleys that allowed him to bolt the door from his bed. He slept with a loaded arquebus, a primitive musket, and unsheathed daggers under his pillow. But Philip had bribed the servants to sabotage the locks. The king entered the room. The guards swarmed the bed, seizing the weapons before the prince could wake. When Carlos finally roused, confused and blinking in the torchlight, he saw his father standing over him like the angel of death. "Does your majesty wish to kill me?" Carlos screamed, weeping, shrinking back against the headboard. Philip replied with a voice devoid of emotion, a voice that sounded like a coffin lid closing. "I am not here as a father, but as a king." Philip ordered the windows to be nailed shut. Every potential weapon, even the metal fire irons, was removed. Don Carlos was a prisoner in his own apartments. The King of Spain had effectively erased his heir from the world of the living. He turned his back on his weeping son and walked out, never to see him again. What followed in that sealed room was a slow, agonizing suicide by gluttony. Isolated, hopeless, and insane, Carlos weaponized his own eating habits to destroy the body that had betrayed him. The Habsburg gluttony, a compulsive need to consume that would plague later generations, took over completely. He fell into a cycle of extreme bulimic violence. He would starve himself for days, refusing all sustenance until he was skeletal, his ribs threatening to pierce his pale skin. Then, in a frenzy of hunger, he would demand massive quantities of food. There are court reports of him consuming an entire spiced partridge pie, heavily seasoned, greasy, and rich, in a single sitting, tearing at the meat with the desperation of a starving animal. His compromised digestive system could not handle the shock. He would vomit until he was retching bile, only to eat again. But the true instrument of his destruction was ice. It was the height of a scorching Spanish summer in July 1568. The heat in the sealed room was stifling. Carlos, burning with fever and madness, ordered huge quantities of ice to be brought to his quarters. He packed the ice around his bed. He cast aside his clothes and lay on the stone floor, surrounded by blocks of ice, trying to freeze the fire in his blood. And then he drank. He drank gallons of ice water, pint after pint, shocking his internal organs with the thermal difference. His body, weakened by generations of inbreeding and months of psychological torture, simply gave up. The combination of starvation, binge eating, and thermal shock induced severe dysentery. The end was not dignified. The Prince of Asturias did not die in battle or in prayer. He died in a pool of his own filth. The dysentery was violent and relentless. His digestive tract collapsed. The internal pressure caused uncontrollable diarrhea and vomiting. He was literally turning inside out. His organs, likely compromised by genetic weakness, effectively exploded from the strain. He lay in the dark, dehydrated, surrounded by the stench of his own waste, crying out for a father who refused to come. On July 24, 1568, Don Carlos finally died. He was 23 years old, but his body looked like that of an old man. He weighed less than 80 pounds. King Philip II did not weep. He treated the death as a necessary administrative task, a surgical removal of a cancerous limb. He ordered a quiet funeral and strictly forbade the court from mourning in public. He wanted to wipe the memory of his son from the official record, burying the prototype monster deep in the crypt of El Escorial. Philip believed that by burying his son, he had buried the problem. He was wrong. Carlos was not an anomaly, he was a prophecy. By the middle of the 17th century, the violent explosions of Don Carlos gave way to a quieter, more insidious threat: silence. For decades, the genetic debt accumulated unpaid and ignored, while the nurseries stood empty. The House of Habsburg was no longer a rising star. It was a dying sun, burning out its last reserves of energy. King Philip IV sat on the throne of Spain, a man carved from melancholy. If you look at the portraits painted by Velázquez during this period, you do not see a warrior. You see a man exhausted by his own existence. His face is long and pallid, dominated by the heavy, protruding Habsburg jaw that makes him look permanently mournful. His eyes are watery and tired. He was a king who had presided over the decline of Spanish military power, but his greatest defeat was personal. His only legitimate son and heir, Prince Baltasar Carlos, had died of smallpox at the age of 16. The death of an heir is a crisis for any monarchy. For the Habsburgs, it was an existential emergency. Philip was 44 years old. He was aging prematurely, his body worn down by the stress of ruling and a lifetime of sexual promiscuity that had left him with a lingering latent case of venereal disease. He needed a son. He needed a womb that could provide him with a replacement for the boy he had lost. And so, the machinery of the Habsburg family turned its gaze inward, looking for a bride. In a decision that defies every instinct of biological preservation, Philip did not look to the fresh blood of France or England. He looked to Austria. He looked to his own family. The bride chosen for him was Mariana of Austria. The horror of this union lies in the specific geometry of their relationship. Mariana was not a distant cousin. She was the daughter of Philip's own sister, Maria Anna. Philip IV was her maternal uncle. Even more disturbing, Mariana had originally been betrothed to Philip's dead son, Balthazar Carlos. She was supposed to be his daughter-in-law. Now she was to be his wife. The family was essentially recycling a bride, moving her from the dead son to the living father like a piece of inherited furniture. The Vatican, eager to keep the Catholic powers united, granted a dispensation for the marriage, ignoring the biblical and biological prohibitions against such a close union. They called it a diplomatic necessity. Nature calls it incest. Mariana was 14 years old. Imagine the journey of this girl. She traveled from the relatively relaxed and joyous court of Vienna to the rigid, suffocating atmosphere of Madrid. She was a child, loud, vibrant, full of laughter, with pink cheeks and bright eyes. She had no idea that she was traveling toward a prison. When she finally arrived in Spain in the autumn of 1649, the reality of her fate crashed down upon her. The meeting between the spouses was a study in grotesque contrast. On one side stood Philip, 44 years old, syphilitic, lame, dour, and weighed down by the black velvet robes of the Spanish court. On the other stood Mariana, 14, terrified, still clutching her dolls, looking up at a man who was literally her mother's brother. She had to kiss his hand. She had to call him husband. The wedding festivities were lavish, designed to mask the rot at the core of the arrangement. There were fireworks, bullfights, and parades, but beneath the pageantry, the court whispered. The ambassadors of foreign nations sent letters home describing the king as looking like a grandfather to his new bride. They noted the sadness in the girl's eyes as the realization settled in. She wasn't just a queen, she was a biological vessel, purchased with a treaty whose sole purpose was to extract a son from an old man. Then came the wedding night. History often draws a veil over the consummation of royal marriages, but to understand the tragedy of the child who would be born from this union, we must confront the reality of that night. It was not a romantic union. It was a medical procedure performed in the dark. Philip IV, driven by a desperate sense of duty, had to perform. But he was a man in physical decline. Mariana was a child who had likely been given no instruction other than to submit. The knowledge of his identity turned the air to lead. The reality of the incest was a burden too heavy to breathe under. There was no intimacy, only the friction of duty. It was the collision of two bloodlines that were already too similar, forced together in a bedchamber in the Alcazar. In that act, they were not creating life, they were sealing a doom. They were layering genetic error upon genetic error. The DNA of the uncle and the DNA of the niece, which shared vast stretches of identical code, were about to combine. The recessive genes for physical deformity, for immune system failure, for mental retardation, genes that would normally be silenced by a healthy partner, were instead being amplified. The tragedy of Mariana began the morning after. The vibrant Austrian girl was systematically crushed by the etiquette of the Spanish court. Madrid in the 17th century was a place of terrifying rigidity. The Queen of Spain was not allowed to be a person. She was an icon. She was forbidden from laughing in public. She was forbidden from being touched. There's a famous, heartbreaking anecdote from her early days in Madrid. Mariana, still a child at heart, laughed at a jester's joke during a court ceremony. She laughed loudly, throwing her head back. The silence that followed was deafening. The Camarera mayor, the head of the household, scolded her publicly, telling her that a Queen of Spain does not laugh. A Queen of Spain is grave. She was scolded for walking too fast. She was scolded for looking out of windows. Slowly the light left her eyes. The 14-year-old girl was erased, replaced by a somber, prayerful woman who spent her days in dark chapels, praying for a son. But the womb of the queen became a graveyard. This is where the horror shifts from the psychological to the biological. The Habsburg curse began to manifest in her pregnancies. The union of uncle and niece resulted in a reproductive disaster. Mariana became pregnant almost immediately, but the fetuses were frail. She suffered miscarriages that were kept secret. When she did carry a child to term, the infants were weak, sickeningly pale, and prone to dying within days. The court doctors, ignorant of genetics, blamed the air, blamed the water, blamed the queen's diet. They bled her. They purged her. They made her drink vile concoctions of crushed gemstones and holy water. They did not understand that the problem was not in the environment. The problem was in the blood. The fetus was trying to develop, but the genetic instructions were garbled. The immune systems of these children were non-existent. Philip IV watched this procession of tiny coffins with a growing sense of divine punishment. He became obsessed with the idea that God was angry with him for his past sins, for his affairs, for his illegitimate children. He spent hours on his knees on the cold stone floors of the Escorial, begging God for one healthy son. He wrote letters to a nun, Sor Maria de Agreda, pouring out his soul, confessing his terror that his dynasty would end with him. "I am grievous," he wrote. "I am the cause of all these deaths." He was closer to the truth than he realized. He was the cause, not because of his sins, but because of his chromosomes, and yet they kept trying. The pressure on Mariana was absolute. Every month, the eyes of the entire court and the spies of France and England were fixed on her waistline. Is she with child? Will it live? Finally, after years of death and disappointment, a pregnancy held. In 1661, Mariana gave birth to a son who did not die immediately. They named him Charles. The bells of Madrid rang out. Bonfires were lit in the streets. Te Deums were sung in the cathedrals. The dynasty was saved. The king wept with relief. But when the courtiers were finally allowed to see the infant, the celebrations faltered. The baby was not a savior. He was a tragedy. The infant Charles was a terrifying sight. His head was enormous, covered in a cradle cap so thick it looked like scales. His jaw, the same jaw that hung from his father's face, was disjointed. He was weak, limp, and silent. He did not cry with the lusty vigor of a future king. He whimpered. Philip IV looked into the cradle and saw the culmination of his life's work. He saw the result of marrying his niece. He saw the end, but he could not admit it. He ordered the doctors to save the boy at all costs. This brings us to the precipice. The uncle and the niece had done their duty. They had produced an heir, but in doing so, they had defied the mathematical laws of biology. They had created a child with a coefficient of inbreeding so high that he was effectively a different species of human, a species designed for extinction. The tragedy of his conception was not a matter of fate, but of mathematics. The true story of the House of Habsburg is written in a specific ruthless number, 0.254. It appears innocuous on a page, a simple decimal point followed by 3 digits. But in the realm of biological science, it is a siren screaming of catastrophe. Science calls this the coefficient of inbreeding. Nature calls it a catastrophe. In a healthy human population, this number should hover close to 0. Nature thrives on diversity. It demands that the genetic contribution of the mother and the genetic contribution of the father be distinct, creating a biological safety net where a dominant good gene can mask a recessive bad gene. However, the House of Habsburg had spent 2 centuries systematically dismantling this safety net. When 2 first cousins marry, as was common in European nobility, their children possess a coefficient of inbreeding of roughly 0.0625. It is a risky genetic gamble, but one that is often survivable. When an uncle marries his niece, the exact configuration of the union between Philip IV and Mariana, the risk doubles, jumping to 0.125. But Charles II was not merely the unlucky product of one isolated incestuous marriage. He was the terminal point of a genealogical collapse. His family tree was not a branching oak that reached out to the world. It was a straight pole that drove itself into the ground. His parents were uncle and niece, his grandmothers were sisters, his great-grandparents were first cousins. The genetic code had been folded over on itself so many times, generation after generation, that the variation required for healthy human life had been completely eroded. When modern scientists analyzed the pedigree of Charles II, they found that his coefficient of inbreeding was 0.254. To put this into a terrifying perspective, if a brother and a sister, siblings who share the exact same mother and father, were to commit the ultimate cultural and biological taboo and conceive a child, that child would have a coefficient of 0.250. Charles II was more inbred than the offspring of a brother and sister. The implications of this mathematical inevitability were absolute and devastating. It meant that for over a quarter of his entire genetic code, Charles possessed 0 variation. He was homozygous for thousands of traits. This meant that every recessive mutation, every dormant disease, and every genetic glitch that had been hiding in the Habsburg bloodline for generations had nowhere to hide. In a normal child, a defective gene from the father is blocked by a healthy gene from the mother. In Charles, the defective gene from the father met the identical defective gene from the mother. The lock met the key, and the door to a biological hell was thrown wide open. The grim toll of this mathematical reality played out in the reproductive history of Queen Mariana. Her body became a filter, desperately trying to reject the non-viable life that the incestuous union was creating. Before Charles managed to cling to life, there was a parade of ghosts. The court records of the time are a litany of tragedy, documenting the births and deaths of children who were never meant to exist. There was the Infanta Margarita Teresa, the beautiful blonde child immortalized in Diego Velázquez's masterpiece, Las Meninas. She survived childhood, but she was fragile, goitrous, and sickly, eventually dying young after being shipped off to Austria to marry yet another uncle, continuing the cycle of abuse. Then there were the others, the ones who are often forgotten by history, but whose brief lives were marked by suffering: Prospero, Ferdinand, Maria. These were the brothers and sisters of Charles, who simply could not survive the weight of their own DNA. They were born, they gasped for air for a few days or weeks, and then they faded away. The court doctors, ignorant of genetics and desperate to explain the inexplicable, recorded these deaths with a mixture of religious fatalism and confusion. They wrote of infants who turned blue, infants who refused to nurse, and infants who suffered from violent, unexplained seizures. In reality, these children were born with organs that hadn't formed correctly, with immune systems that were completely absent, or with metabolisms that could not process the most basic nutrients. They were the statistical errors that the number 0.254 demanded, the casualties of a war against biology. King Philip IV watched his children die one by one, his despair deepening with every small white coffin that was carried down to the freezing crypt of the Escorial. The atmosphere in the royal Alcazar was suffocating. The king, once a patron of the arts and a lover of life, transformed into a ghost haunting his own halls, consumed by guilt. He became obsessed with the idea that God was punishing him for his past sins, for his illicit affairs, and for the illegitimate children he had fathered in his youth. He spent hours on his knees on the cold stone floors, begging God for one healthy son to secure the succession. He wrote agonizing letters to a nun, Sor Maria de Agreda, pouring out his soul and confessing his terror that his dynasty would end with him. "I am grievous," he wrote, his pen scratching out the confession of a broken man. "I am the cause of all these deaths." He was closer to the truth than he realized. He was the cause, not because of his moral failings, but because of his chromosomes. He was trying to build a future, using only the damaged bricks of the past. And yet, despite the carnage, the royal couple kept trying. The pressure on Queen Mariana was relentless and cruel. Every month, the eyes of the entire Spanish court and the spies of rival nations like France and England were fixed on her waistline. Is she with child? Will it live? The ambassadors circled like vultures, waiting for the news of a stillbirth or a sterile queen so they could begin the political maneuvering to carve up the Spanish Empire. Finally, in 1661, after years of death and disappointment, a pregnancy held. The tension in Madrid was electric as the queen entered her confinement. On November 6th, the child was born. They named him Charles. The church bells of Madrid rang out in a chaotic peal of triumph. Bonfires were lit in the streets, and Te Deums were sung in every cathedral. The dynasty was saved. The king wept with relief, believing that his prayers had finally been answered. But the joy was performative, a thin veneer stretched over a horrific reality. When the courtiers and ambassadors were finally allowed to see the infant prince, the celebrations faltered, replaced by a stunned and uncomfortable silence. The baby was not a savior. He was a tragedy made flesh. The French ambassador, writing back to King Louis XIV, dispensed with diplomatic niceties and described the heir to the throne as a creature of pity and revulsion. The baby was exceptionally small, frail, and lacked the robust vitality of a newborn, but it was his head that drew the eye. It was of grotesque proportions, disproportionately large for his withered body, and covered in a thick, scaly cradle cap that looked like the skin of a reptile. His skull was soft, pulsing visibly with fluid, an early sign of the hydrocephalus, water on the brain, that would plague him for the rest of his life. The fontanelle, the soft spot on a baby's head that typically closes in infancy, would remain open for years, leaving his brain vulnerable and exposed. Most disturbingly, the infamous Habsburg jaw, the mandibular prognathism that had been the signature of the family, was present from day one in its most extreme form. In a normal newborn, the jaw is usually recessed, allowing for easy latching. In Charles, the lower mandible jutted out aggressively, misaligned with the upper gum. This was not just a cosmetic issue, it was a survival hazard. The wet nurses struggled desperately to feed him because his mouth could not form a proper seal around the breast. He was starving from the moment he was born, not for lack of food, but for lack of the mechanical ability to eat it. He did not cry with the lusty vigor of a future king. He whimpered, a weak, high-pitched sound that chilled the blood of those who heard it. He was a success only in the biological sense, that his heart was beating and his lungs were drawing air. In every other metric, he was a disaster. This was the mathematics of doom made flesh. The number 0.254 had taken human form in the cradle of the Spanish Empire. Charles was not merely a sick child. He was the endpoint of a genetic algorithm that had been running without correction for 200 years. The system had finally crashed. As Philip IV looked down at his son, this weak, pale, misshapen thing that required a team of doctors just to keep breathing, he must have felt the cold hand of inevitability gripping his heart. He had married his niece to preserve the purity of his blood, to ensure that the Spanish crown remained in Habsburg hands, and he had succeeded. The blood was pure. It was pure poison. The architects had finished their work. They had built the house of their dreams, but they had built it on a foundation of quicksand. Now they would have to live in it as it collapsed on top of them. The era of the monster king had begun, and the suffering of the boy in the cradle was only just beginning. In September 1665, King Philip IV finally succumbed to the misery that had plagued his final years. He died, leaving the Spanish Empire, a colossus that spanned the globe from the Philippines to the Andes, in the hands of his only surviving legitimate son. The titles were read out by the heralds: King of Castile, King of Leon, King of Naples, King of Jerusalem. But the creature inheriting these titles was not a king in any recognizable sense. He was a 4-year-old boy who could not walk, could not speak, and could barely hold his own head up. The childhood of Charles II is a story of profound neglect masquerading as protection. It was a childhood spent not in a nursery, but in a padded cell of the court's making. Because the boy was so fragile, because the dynasty hung by such a terrifyingly thin thread, the court decided that the priority was not to educate him or to train him, but simply to keep him from breaking. The physical reality of his early years was grotesque. At the age of 4, when he ascended the throne, Charles was still being breastfed. This was highly irregular for the time, even for royalty, but it was a medical necessity. His jaw deformity was so severe that he could not chew solid food. Every attempt to wean him onto broths or soft meats resulted in choking fits or vomiting, so the King of Spain remained attached to the breast of a wet nurse until he was nearly 5 years old. The palace records show that he went through 14 wet nurses. These women were brought in from the countryside, screened for health, and paid a fortune to sustain the monarch. But it was a thankless task. The boy was weak, often too exhausted to suckle, and when he did, the misalignment of his gums caused pain to the nurses. He existed in a state of permanent infantilization, a toddler who was treated like a newborn, trapped in a cycle of dependency that stunted his emotional development as much as his physical growth. But the most haunting image of his childhood is the box. Charles suffered from severe rickets, a softening of the bones caused by a vitamin D deficiency, likely a result of his inability to process nutrients and the fact that he was kept constantly indoors, away from the dangerous sun. His legs were spindly and warped, unable to support the weight of his torso. While other princes were learning to ride ponies or fence with wooden swords, Charles was kept in a literal box. It was a specially constructed sedan chair, lined with thick cotton and velvet. He was carried everywhere. The courtiers were forbidden from letting him walk, terrified that a fall would shatter his glass-like bones. Imagine the life of a child who is never allowed to explore the world with his own limbs. He was a prisoner of his own fragility, moved from room to room like a porcelain doll. He did not take his first unaided steps until he was 8 years old. Even then, his gait was a stumbling, lurching shuffle that required him to hold onto walls or the arms of attendants. This extreme protectionism extended to his hygiene, with disastrous results. The doctors of the 17th century held the belief that bathing opened the pores to miasma and disease. For a boy as sickly as Charles, water was considered a death sentence. Consequently, the King of Spain was almost never washed. He lived in a state of accumulation. Dirt, sweat, and dead skin built up on his frail body. His hair, which was sparse and fine, became a breeding ground for lice and scabs. He suffered from a severe case of cradle cap, seborrheic dermatitis, that was never treated. It formed a thick, crusty layer on his scalp that oozed and smelled. The stench of the royal nursery was reportedly overpowering, a mix of unwashed bodies, sour milk, and sickness. The most powerful child in the world was living in squalor, not because of poverty, but because of a medical ignorance that viewed cleanliness as a threat to his survival. Because everyone expected him to die before he reached puberty, his education was considered a waste of time. Why teach a corpse to read? While his cousin and rival, Louis XIV of France, was being groomed to become the Sun King, learning history, military strategy, languages, and dance, Charles was left to rot in his cotton box. His mother, Queen Joanna, overwhelmed by the task of acting as regent, simply ignored his mind to focus on his body. At the age of 10, the King of Spain was illiterate. He could not read the treaties he would one day have to sign. He could not write his own name. He spent his days playing games that were tragically simple for his age. He wandered the gardens of the Escorial with the court dwarfs. These dwarfs were the only true companions he had. They were the only people who did not look down on him, perhaps because they, too, were seen as physical curiosities by the court. He formed deep emotional bonds with them, finding comfort in a community of outsiders within his own palace. But even this was viewed with disdain by the nobility, who saw the king rolling in the dirt with jesters as a sign of his mental vacuity. As Charles grew older and his physical deformities became more pronounced, the mood in the palace shifted from medical concern to supernatural terror. The doctors had failed. The boy was still seizing, still drooling, still unable to learn. In the deeply religious and superstitious atmosphere of 17th century Spain, there was only one explanation left. The king was not sick, he was cursed. This is the origin of his moniker, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. The logic was cruel but consistent with the worldview of the time. God would not inflict such suffering on his anointed king unless the devil was involved. Rumors began to swirl that Charles had been hexed while in the womb, or that his mother had been given a potion by enemies of the state. The solution, therefore, was not medicine, but exorcism. The treatments that followed were a form of religious abuse inflicted on a disabled child. Priests and monks were brought into the royal bedchamber to perform rites of exorcism. The boy was stripped of his robes and forced to lie on the cold stone floor while holy water was splashed onto his face. Incense was burned until the air was thick and choking. Men in robes shouted Latin commands at the demons they believed were hiding inside his twisted bones. They forced him to drink oil blessed by saints. They placed relics, pieces of bone, scraps of cloth from martyrs, directly onto his body, tying them to his limbs with ribbons. Charles, terrified and confused, would weep and beg them to stop. He internalized this narrative deeply. He grew up believing that he was indeed a vessel of Satan, that his own body was a battlefield between good and evil. This psychological trauma was devastating. He became incredibly pious, spending hours praying for forgiveness for the sin of being born disabled. He was terrified of the dark, terrified of being alone, convinced that demons were waiting in the shadows to twist his limbs further. The tragedy of Charles II's childhood is that he was failed by every institution meant to protect him. His family used him as a political prop. His doctors used him as a testing ground for archaic theories. His church used him as a prop for spiritual warfare. By the time he reached adolescence, the child of cotton had survived against all odds. He was alive, but he was a ruin. He was an illiterate, unwashed, terrified boy king who believed he was possessed by the devil, ruling over an empire that was crumbling just as fast as his own body. And yet, the biological horror was only just beginning to accelerate. As puberty hit, the hormones that drive growth and sexual development would interact with his corrupted DNA to produce a physical transformation that was nothing short of nightmarish. The jaw would grow, the tongue would swell, and the king would lose the ability to speak to his own people. As Charles II emerged from the dark, suffocating cocoon of his childhood and technically assumed the powers of the monarchy at the age of 14, the Spanish court held its collective breath. They prayed that the onset of puberty might bring a miraculous surge of vitality, that the hormones of adolescence might harden the frail boy into a man capable of ruling the world. Instead, the maturation process acted like a biological accelerant on his deformities. The genetic script that had been written by 2 centuries of inbreeding was now entering its final, most destructive chapter. The Habsburg jaw, which had been a pitiable defect in his infancy, grew with him, expanding into a monstrous impediment that would come to dominate his entire existence and define the grotesque tragedy of his reign. To look upon the face of the adult king of Spain was to witness a biological impossibility, a piece of human architecture that had collapsed under the weight of its own design. The lower half of his face seemed to belong to a giant, while the upper half remained that of a sickly child. His mandible was not merely prominent, it was deformed to a degree that defied medical explanation. The lower jaw protruded so aggressively, jutting out nearly 2 full inches beyond the upper maxilla, that the fundamental mechanics of his mouth were broken. The teeth could not meet. There was no bite. The simple primal act of closing one's mouth, a reflex that defines the resting state of the human face, was physically impossible for him. His mouth hung permanently open, a gaping wet wound in the center of the royal countenance, exposing the interior of his throat to the world. This structural failure led to the most relentless and humiliating aspect of his daily life, the drool. Because his lips could not seal, and because he suffered from severe macroglossia, an abnormally enlarged tongue that filled his oral cavity like a swollen sponge, he had zero control over his own saliva. It did not stay contained. It pooled in the floor of his mouth and dripped constantly, a steady viscous stream that stained his chin, his lace collars, and his velvet robes. Handkerchiefs were not mere fashion. Accessories for Charles. They were essential medical equipment, desperate tools of dignity. He was never seen without one clamped to his lower face, a white flag of surrender against his own biology. His attendants were tasked with a ceaseless cycle of wiping the king's chin, a ritual that stripped away the aura of divinity and replaced it with the grim reality of patient care. But the horror of his mouth went far beyond aesthetics. It destroyed his ability to communicate, isolating him inside a prison of his own flesh. The King of Spain, the ruler of the greatest empire on earth, could barely make himself understood to his own servants. His enlarged tongue, too big for the cavern of his mouth, made the articulation of consonants a titanic struggle. His speech was not a voice. It was a thick, wet mumble, a garbled stream of vowel sounds and choking noises that required his courtiers to lean in uncomfortably close to decipher. The court of Madrid became a theater of awkward silence and feigned understanding. Ambassadors and ministers would nod solemnly as the king spoke, pretending to comprehend his orders while, in reality, they were terrified of asking him to repeat himself and exposing the humiliating truth that the king was speaking gibberish. He was shouting from behind a wall of his own body and no one could hear him. However, the true nightmare of Charles's existence, the moment where body horror became a public spectacle, played out 3 times a day at the dining table. In the 17th century, royal dining was a public act, a ceremony of power where the monarch ate while the greatest nobles of the land watched. For Charles II, this was not a ceremony, it was a recurring torture session. Because his upper and lower teeth could not make contact, the act of mastication, chewing, was physically impossible. He could not grind meat. He could not break down bread. He could not process vegetables. He was forced to adapt in a way that was both pitiful and repulsive to behold. He would take food and swallow it whole. Foreign ambassadors writing in secret ciphers back to their capitals describe watching the King of Spain eat with a mixture of morbid fascination and nausea. He would take chunks of boiled capon or spiced beef and place them on his tongue. Then he would tilt his head back, jerking his neck like a bird of prey or a snake, using gravity to force the unchewed mass down his gullet. This gluttonous style was not born of a lack of manners, but of desperate necessity. But the human stomach is not designed to process unmasticated food. The result was a digestive catastrophe that played out in real time. Charles suffered from chronic, debilitating indigestion. His stomach, bombarded by whole pieces of meat, would frequently rebel. It was not uncommon, indeed it was expected, for the king to be seized by violent stomach cramps in the middle of a state dinner. His face would turn ashen, his eyes would water, and then, in front of the entire court, he would vomit. He would regurgitate the whole pieces of food he had just swallowed, the bile and the waste spilling onto the royal table. The courtiers would look away, the musicians in the gallery would play louder to mask the sound of the king retching, and the servants would rush with buckets and cloths to clean the mess. It was a daily ritual of abject humiliation that reinforced his status not as a divine ruler, but as a broken, rotting organism. The smell of sour vomit became as associated with the king's presence as the smell of incense. And then there was the aging. Charles II was denied the simple mercy of a prime. He did not grow from a boy into a young man. He went from a sickly child directly to a senile old man, bypassing the vitality of youth entirely. By the time he was in his 20s, an age when his rival, Louis XIV of France, was dancing in ballets, hunting stags, and leading armies, Charles was physically disintegrating. The genetic clock inside him was ticking at a terrifyingly accelerated rate. His hair, which had been blonde and fine in his youth, began to fall out in clumps, leaving him bald and requiring him to wear heavy, itchy wigs to hide his scaly scalp. His eyesight failed early, the world blurring into a haze that matched his mental fog. His hearing began to fade, locking him further into isolation. But it was his legs that betrayed him most cruelly. Always weak from the rickets of his childhood, his legs became severely edematous, swollen with fluid, until the skin was tight and shiny. He could barely stand for more than a few minutes. At the age of 28, he walked with a cane, shuffling with the stooped, painful posture of an octogenarian. He complained of constant grinding aches in his joints, likely a symptom of the genetic inflammation and renal failure that was slowly poisoning his system. But the most tragic aspect of his adulthood was not physical, it was psychological. It is a common misconception that Charles was mad in the way his ancestor Joanna was, or a raving lunatic like Don Carlos. He was not. He was simply slow. He was a man with the mind of a frightened child, trapped in a decaying labyrinth of a body. And the horror lay in the fact that he was aware of it. This is the heartbreaking core of his character, his lucid moments. He knew he was incompetent. He possessed enough awareness to understand his own uselessness. He would sit in the Council of State staring blankly at maps of territories he would never visit, Flanders, Milan, the Americas, listening to generals discuss wars he could not understand. He would try to sign documents, his hand trembling so violently from weakness and neurological spasms that the signature was often just a smudge of ink. He knew the ministers were patient with him, only out of duty. He knew his mother, Mariana, and a succession of validos, favorites, were the true rulers, pulling his strings. He was a puppet, but a puppet made of flesh and nerve endings that could feel pain. He knew the court laughed at him behind their fans. He knew the French ambassador wrote letters mocking his ugliness. He felt the revulsion of the women who were brought near him. There is a profound cosmic loneliness to the figure of the rotting king. He spent his days wandering the dark tapestry-lined corridors of the Alcazar, moving from chapel to chapel like a ghost haunting his own house. He became obsessively pious, spending hours on his knees, despite the pain, praying for a cure that never came. He believed, with the terrified conviction of a child, that his deformity was a punishment for sins he hadn't committed or a sign that the devil was living inside his bones. He was surrounded by the gold of the Americas, by the masterpieces of Velázquez and Rubens, by the wealth of the Indies. But he was a prisoner of his own biology. He was a man rotting from the inside out, a living testament to the hubris of his ancestors, who thought they could cheat nature. And yet the tragedy was not over. The final, cruelest demand of his station remained. The monster had to create an heir. The court, in its infinite cruelty and desperation, decided that this broken man, who could barely feed himself without vomiting, who could barely stand without a cane, needed a wife. They needed to put a young, healthy woman into the bed of the rotting king and hope that a spark of life could be extracted from the dying embers of his corrupted DNA. This leads us to the darkest chapter of his personal life, the women who were sacrificed to the beast. The first of them, a vibrant French princess, was about to walk into the Alcazar, thinking she was marrying a king, only to find she was marrying a corpse that hadn't yet stopped breathing. The year was 1679, and the gloomy, incense-choked corridors of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid were about to be pierced by the arrival of a creature who seemed to belong to a different biological species entirely. Her name was Marie-Louise of Orléans. She was 17 years old, the niece of the Sun King, Louis XIV of France, and she was everything the Habsburgs were not. She was healthy, she was sane, she was vibrant, and she was breathtakingly beautiful. She had grown up in the glittering mirror-lined halls of Versailles and the Palais Royal, surrounded by the most sophisticated and hedonistic culture in Europe. She was a girl of the sun, who loved to ride horses at breakneck speed through the forests of Saint-Cloud, who loved to dance in ballets until dawn, and who was deeply, passionately in love with her handsome cousin, the Dauphin. She was a symbol of life at its most abundant, a golden bird soaring in the prime of her youth. But in the cold, ruthless calculus of 17th century geopolitics, a princess is not a person with dreams or desires. She is a form of currency. She is a peace treaty wrapped in silk. And Marie-Louise was about to be spent to buy a truce between two warring empires. When the news broke that she was to be sacrificed to Charles II, the infamous monster king of Spain, to secure a political alliance, the reality of her fate struck her with the force of a physical blow. She threw herself at the feet of her uncle Louis XIV in a display of raw, unfiltered grief that shocked the composed French court. She wept hysterically. She begged for mercy. She famously cried out, "Sire, will you send me to be the Queen of Spain? It is a sentence of death." She knew, with a terrifying prescience, that she was not being sent to a marriage bed, but to a mausoleum. The King of France, a man of ice and pragmatism, looked down at his sobbing niece and delivered a line that sealed her doom. "I cannot make you the Queen of France, my dear, so I am making you the Queen of Spain. It is my will." With those few cold words, the cage door slammed shut. The girl who loved to dance was stripped of her future and packaged for export to a land of shadows. The journey from Paris to Madrid was a slow, agonizing descent into hell, a funeral procession for the living. As her carriage rolled south, leaving the lush greenery of France for the arid, dusty plains of the Iberian Peninsula, Marie-Louise was forced to undergo a ritualistic stripping of her identity. This process culminated at the Bidasoa River, the natural border between the two nations. In a rigid, dehumanizing ceremony known as the entombed delivery, she was systematically erased. Her French servants, the friends and confidants who had known her since birth, were dismissed and sent back in tears. Her French clothes, the light, fashionable, revealing silks of Versailles that celebrated the female form, were taken away. In their place, she was encased in the heavy, stiff, suffocating velvet of the Spanish court. These were not dresses. They were suits of armor designed to erase the body, to hide the woman, and to restrict movement. The wide farthingales made it difficult to walk. The high, stiff collars choked her. She was told to stop smiling, for in Spain, joy was considered undignified. She was told to lower her eyes. The transformation was total. The French princess was dead. The Spanish property had been delivered. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare the 17-year-old girl for the physical reality of her husband. The meeting took place on a dusty, windswept road near the village of Quintana Pala, just outside of Burgos. Charles II, driven by a frantic, almost boyish excitement to see his prize, had ridden out to meet her. When Marie-Louise looked out of the window of her carriage, expecting to see a king, she saw a biological ruin. Charles was 18 years old at the time, but he looked like a senile man of 40 who had been shrinking in the wash. He was pale as parchment, his skin translucent and sickly, his legs so weak and spindly that he had to be physically lifted down from his horse by his attendants. His long, lank hair hung in greasy curtains around a face that was the stuff of nightmares. It is said that when she stepped out of the carriage to kiss his hand, she was trembling so violently that she nearly collapsed into the dust. She found herself staring into the face of genetic collapse. The massive, jutting Habsburg jaw protruded so far that his mouth hung permanently open, a wet, gaping cavern. The drool glistened on his chin, defying the constant wiping of his handkerchiefs. His large, watery eyes stared at her with an intensity that bordered on madness. Charles, for his part, was struck dumb. He had lived his entire life surrounded by sickness, deformity, and gloomy piety. Marie Louise, with her flawless skin and terrified eyes, was an alien being to him. He fell instantly, obsessively in love. But it was a terrifying, suffocating love. He stared at her constantly, his mouth agape, like a starving man looking at a banquet he did not know how to eat. He wanted to possess her completely, to absorb her vitality into his own decaying frame. For Marie Louise, every look from him was a violation. She had to force herself not to recoil when he leaned in, smelling of sour milk and stomach bile, to whisper garbled endearments that she could not understand. Then came the wedding night. In the secret annals of royal history, few events are as pathetic and harrowing as the consummation of the marriage between Charles II and Marie Louise. The bedroom of the palace became a chamber of horrors for the young French girl. She was trapped in the dark with a man she found physically repulsive, a man whose very touch made her skin crawl. But the horror wasn't violence, it was incompetence. Charles was desperate to perform his duty. He knew the empire needed an heir, he knew his masculinity was on trial, but his body, broken in so many ways, failed him here as well. Historical accounts and diplomatic dispatches from the time suggest that Charles suffered from severe sexual dysfunction, likely premature ejaculation linked to his neurological hypersensitivity, or perhaps complete impotence caused by his hormonal imbalances, specifically Klinefelter syndrome. The scene inside the bedchamber was one of claustrophobic terror. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight. The room was stiflingly hot. The king, fumbling and weeping in frustration, apologizing in his garbled, wet speech, his saliva dripping onto her skin. The queen, lying rigid in the dark, staring at the canopy of the bed as if it were a coffin lid. She was torn between the immense relief that he couldn't physically complete the act and the terrified realization that her sole purpose in life, to bear a child, might be impossible with this man. She was not being ravished. She was being haunted. She spent that night, and many sleepless nights after, listening to the labored, wheezing breathing of a husband who was rotting beside her, wondering if she would die in this room, barren and forgotten. The morning after brought no relief. The Spanish court, sensing her foreignness like a virus, clamped down on Marie Louise with iron claws. Her primary jailer was the Camerera Mayor, the Duchess of Terranova. The Duchess was a fanatic, a woman of terrifying severity who believed that a Queen of Spain should be a statue, silent, immobile, and devout. She hated Marie Louise's French spirit. She hated her laughter. She set about breaking the girl's will with a sadism that was almost impressive in its pettiness. She forbade Marie Louise from looking out of the palace windows, telling her that a queen does not gaze at the common world. She forbade her from laughing in public. She monitored her conversations, her letters, even her prayers. The psychological isolation was absolute. Marie Louise was surrounded by spies who reported her every movement to the Duchess. She had no friends, only a husband who followed her around the palace like a confused puppy, drooling and staring, professing a love that felt heavy and suffocating. He would bring her gifts, diamonds, emeralds, trays of gold, but he couldn't give her the one thing she needed, a child. And he couldn't give her the one thing she wanted, freedom. The golden cage had closed. The breaking point of her spirit is best illustrated by the story of the parrots. When Marie Louise arrived from France, she brought with her a few cages of brightly colored parrots. They were her only link to her past life, the only living things in the gloomy Alcazar that were vibrant and loud. They chattered, they screeched, and they made the queen smile. The Duchess of Terranova despised them. She saw them as a symbol of French frivolity. One afternoon, finding the noise undignified for a Spanish court, The Duchess allegedly ordered the birds to be strangled. When Marie-Louise returned to her chambers, she found her pets dead, their necks snapped. She wept for days. It was a clear message. Everything you love will die here. Assimilate or perish. As the months turned into years, the vibrancy of Versailles drained out of her, replaced by the waxen pallor of the Alcazar. She realized that she was trapped in a gilded mausoleum, but within hours, the pain metastasized into agony. She collapsed in her chambers, writhing on the bed, screaming that her stomach was on fire. The scene that unfolded over the next 24 hours was a masterpiece of medical incompetence. The doctors swarmed the dying queen, but instead of alleviating her pain, they accelerated her death. Diagnosing her with bad humors, they bled her. They cut into the veins of a woman who was already in shock, draining her vitality into silver bowls while she begged for water. They administered strong emetics, forcing her to vomit violently, which only ruptured her internal injuries further. The modern consensus is that she likely suffered from a burst appendix or peritonitis, a condition that is fatal without surgery. But in 1689, it was a death sentence that was interpreted through the lens of paranoia. As the queen screamed in agony, a whisper ran through the Alcazar like a lit fuse: poison. The political tension between France and Austria was at a breaking point. Many believed that the Austrian faction at court, led by the king's mother Mariana, wanted the French queen dead so Charles could marry a German princess. Marie-Louise herself believed it. In her delirium, she cried out to Charles, "They have poisoned me. I know they have poisoned me." This accusation turned the death chamber into a crime scene. The king was hysterical. He threw himself onto the bed, weeping uncontrollably, begging the doctors to save her, threatening to execute them all if she died. But the monster king was powerless against biology. The final moments of Marie-Louise were a tableau of heartbreak. As the end approached, her pain seemed to subside, a sign of gangrene setting in, and she gained a moment of terrifying clarity. She looked at Charles, the man she had dreaded marrying, the man whose touch had once repulsed her, and she saw the utter devastation in his eyes. She realized that she was the only shield he had against a cruel world. Her final words to him were recorded by witnesses and remain one of the most poignant lines in royal history. She took his hand, looked into his watery, vacant eyes, and whispered, "Your Majesty might have other wives, but no one will ever love you as I do." It was a final act of mercy, a lie told to comfort a dying man, or perhaps a profound truth born of shared suffering. She died on February 12, 1689. She was 26. The aftermath of her death was immediate and brutal. Charles II collapsed. He had lost his wife, his nurse, and his only friend. He fell into a state of catatonic grief, refusing to leave her body, howling like a wounded animal. He had to be physically dragged away from her deathbed so the undertakers could do their work. For days, he sat in the dark, rocking back and forth, muttering her name, holding the little trinkets she had given him. He told anyone who would listen, "I shall not survive her long." But the machinery of the Habsburg state had no heart. The body of Marie-Louise was barely cold. The incense from her funeral mass was still hanging in the air of the Escorial when the Council of State met. They did not discuss the king's grief. They discussed his sperm. The French wife had failed. The French experiment was over. They needed a new womb, and they needed it immediately. The king was rotting, and time was running out. While Charles wept for his golden bird, his ministers were already writing letters to Germany, selecting the next victim. She would be a woman of a very different temperament, a woman who would not pity the king, but terrify him. The tragedy of Marie Louise is that she was the last flicker of humanity in Charles's life. With her death, the light went out in the Alcazar forever. The king was now alone in the dark with his demons, and the next woman to enter his bedroom would bring those demons to life in ways he could never have imagined. The tears of Charles II were still wet on his cheeks, and the body of Marie Louise was barely cold in the royal crypt when the machinery of the Spanish Empire ground into motion once again. The Council of State, a collection of grim-faced men in black velvet, did not have the luxury of grief. They faced a mathematical and political emergency. The king was 28 years old, but his body was that of a senile man of 80. The French experiment had failed. There was no heir. The dynasty was staring into the abyss of extinction. They needed a new womb, and they needed it immediately. They could not afford love. They could not afford beauty. They needed biological utility. They scoured the royal houses of Europe with the cold detachment of horse breeders, looking for a genetic anomaly that could counter the rot of the Habsburg bloodline. They found their answer in the frozen lands of Germany, in the House of Palatinate Neuburg. The candidate was Maria Anna of Neuburg. On paper, she was the perfect antidote to the Habsburg curse. Her qualification for the throne of Spain was singular, and in the eyes of the ministers, miraculous. Her mother, the Electress Elizabeth Amalie, had given birth to 23 children. 23. To the desperate Spanish court, this number was a talisman. They believed that fertility was a simple transferable trait, like hair color or height. They reasoned that a woman coming from such a superfertile stock would be unable to stop conceiving, even with a husband as broken as Charles. They convinced themselves that the sheer biological force of the Neuburg bloodline would overwhelm the frailty of the Habsburg seed. They were wrong. They were not importing a savior. They were importing a predator. Maria Anna arrived in Spain in May 1690, and from the moment her boots touched Spanish soil, the atmosphere in the court shifted from mourning to terror. If Marie Louise had been a dove, gentle, frightened, and easily crushed, Maria Anna was a hawk. She was tall, imposing, with a mane of fiery red hair and a temper to match. She was 22 years old, but she possessed the hardness of a veteran politician. She had not come to Spain to be a nursemaid to a dying imbecile. She had come to rule an empire. She looked around the gloomy, dusty halls of the Alcazar. She looked at the courtiers who bowed and scraped. And she looked at the trembling, drooling creature who was supposed to be her husband. And she felt nothing but contempt. The meeting between the spouses was a study in cruelty. Charles, simple-hearted and desperate for affection, hoped that this new wife would be another Marie Louise. He hoped for pity. He hoped for a hand to hold in the dark. Instead, he got a drill sergeant. Maria Anna did not try to hide her revulsion. When Charles leaned in to kiss her, struggling with his oversized tongue and dripping saliva, she recoiled visibly. She did not coddle him. She looked at him with the cold, assessing stare of a butcher looking at a piece of spoiled meat. She realized immediately that the man standing before her was not a king in any functional sense, but a vacuum of power, and nature abhors a vacuum. Maria Anna stepped into the void and seized the crown for herself. Her reign as queen was characterized by a domestic tyranny that turned the palace into a battlefield. She was intelligent, educated, and ferociously ambitious. She recognized that Charles was a puppet, and she determined that she would be the only one pulling the strings. She began a systematic campaign to isolate the king. She fired his trusted servants. She banished the courtiers who had been loyal to Marie Louise. She even waged war on the memory of the dead queen. Charles, in his sentimental grief, kept portraits of Marie Louise in his chambers and would often weep over them. Maria Anna, fueled by a jealous rage that was less about love and more about possession, ordered the portraits removed. She forbade the king from speaking the name of his first wife. She wanted to erase the ghost of the French girl so that she alone occupied the king's feeble mind. The dynamic of their marriage was an inversion of the natural order of the 17th century. In an era where the husband was the absolute master, Charles became a battered spouse. He was terrified of her. The monster king, who could technically order the execution of anyone in his dominions, would shrink away when Maria Anna raised her voice. And she raised it often. Her tantrums were legendary. She would scream at ministers, throw objects across the room, and berate the king for his incompetence. Charles, weakened by his constant illnesses and his gentle nature, simply collapsed under her fury. He would retreat to his chapel, praying for peace while his wife rampaged through the state apartments. But Maria Anna was not just angry, she was greedy. She realized early on that the chances of having a child with Charles were non-existent. She saw what the doctors refused to admit. The king was sexually and biologically dead. Realizing that her time as queen might be limited by his inevitable death, she decided to loot the ship before it sank. She became known as the Vulture of Newburgh. She began to systematically siphon off the wealth of the Spanish Empire. She stole jewelry from the crown collection. She embezzled funds from the treasury. She packed crates of art, gold, and tapestries and shipped them back to her family in Germany. The court watched in horror as their queen picked the carcass of the empire clean, but they were powerless to stop her because she held the king hostage. The cruelest aspect of her manipulation, however, was the weaponization of hope. Maria Anna knew that her only true hold on power and her only safety from the anger of the Spanish people lay in her womb. As long as there was a chance of an heir, she was untouchable. So she faked it. This is the most psychological horror of her tenure. On multiple occasions, Maria Anna declared herself pregnant. She would announce the cessation of her courses. She would feign morning sickness. She would pad her belly. The court would erupt in desperate joy. Bonfires would be lit. Prayers would be said. Charles, poor, deluded Charles, would be beside himself with happiness. He would weep with gratitude, believing that God had finally forgiven him. He would treat her like a porcelain idol, giving her anything she asked for. And then, after months of charade, she would announce a miscarriage. She played this cruel game repeatedly. Each time, she crushed the king's spirit a little more. Imagine the devastation of a man who believes he is finally going to be a father, finally going to justify his existence, only to have the rug pulled out from under him again and again. It was emotional torture. Modern historians debate whether these were phantom pregnancies caused by her own desperate desire for power or cold-blooded lies. Given her character, the latter seems more likely. She used her reproductive status as a political shield, buying herself time while she stole everything not nailed down. By the mid-1690s, the situation in the palace had become toxic. The king was visibly dying. His body was failing. His legs could barely support him. His digestion was a constant agony. But his mind was the true casualty. Living under the thumb of the vulture, convinced of his own failure, terrorized by a wife who hated him, Charles began to lose his grip on reality. He wasn't just depressed, he was disintegrating. Maria Anna, seeing the end approaching, became even more desperate. She knew that the moment Charles took his last breath, her protection would vanish. The Spanish court hated her. The people of Madrid called her the German witch. She needed a miracle. And when biology failed and politics failed, she turned to the darkness. She began to encourage the rumors that were whispering through the corridors, the rumors that the king's impotence was not natural. She fed the fire of superstition. If she couldn't get a child out of him, she would blame the devil. She shifted the narrative from "the king is sick" to "the king is cursed." This pivot marked the transition from a political thriller to a supernatural nightmare. The queen, the vulture, opened the gates of the Alcazar to the fanatics. She allowed the Inquisition and the exorcists to enter the king's bedchamber. She stood by and watched as they tortured her husband in the name of God, hoping that perhaps, if they beat the devil out of him, he might live long enough to secure her future. The vulture was done picking at the flesh. Now she was ready to crack the bones. By the year 1698, the Royal Alcazar of Madrid had ceased to function as a palace of government and had transformed into a grotesque theater of the macabre. The King of Spain was no longer treated as a patient suffering from a complex, cascading array of genetic disorders. He was treated as a battlefield in a spiritual war between heaven and hell. When the most renowned physicians in Europe failed to cure his sterility, his frequent epileptic seizures, and his chronic agonizing digestive rot, the Spanish mind, steeped in the dark, feverish mysticism of the Inquisition, turned to the only explanation that made sense to their medieval worldview: witchcraft. The diagnosis was whispered first by the queen, then by the confessor, and finally shouted by the mob outside the palace gates. The king was not sick. The king was hechizado, bewitched. This diagnosis marked the descent of Charles II's life from a tragedy of biology into a horror story of pure, unadulterated superstition. It was a convenient narrative for everyone involved, a way to absolve the court of its failures. For Maria Anna, the vulture, it exonerated her barren womb. It wasn't her fault she couldn't conceive. It was because jealous demons had tied the king's seed in knots. For the church, it was a golden opportunity to exert total control over the monarchy in its final hours. And for Charles, the terrified child man who had lived his entire life in pain, it was a confirmation of his lifelong nightmare that he was indeed a monster, a vessel of sin, hated by God and hunted by the devil. He accepted the diagnosis not with skepticism, but with the pathetic relief of a man who finally has a name for his suffering. The great exorcism of Charles II began with the arrival of Fray Mauro Tenda, an extremist Capuchin monk whose reputation for battling demons was as terrifying as the entities he claimed to fight. He did not come to the palace to comfort the dying king. He came to purge him. The king's bedchamber, once a place of rest, was stripped of its luxury and turned into a torture cell disguised as a chapel. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, and the windows were draped in layers of black cloth to block out the sun, for the inquisitors believed that evil hid in the light. The air in the room became thick, suffocating, and unbreathable, choked with the smoke of heavy ecclesiastical incense and bundles of burning sage, designed to smoke out the spirits like rats in a cellar. In this stifling darkness, the final degradation of Charles II began. The cruelty of the scene was absolute. The ruler of the global Spanish Empire, a man who could not chew his own food or walk without a cane, was divested of his royal garments and secured to his bed with leather straps. The monks believed that the demons were hiding physically inside his twisted organs, nesting in his entrails, and they had to be driven out by force. Fray Tenda and the Grand Inquisitor, Cardinal Rocaberti, would loom over the trembling, exposed king, screaming commands in Latin, splashing him with scalding holy water, and pressing heavy iron crucifixes against his pale, bruised skin with such force that they left indentations in his flesh. They shouted at his stomach, at his groin, commanding the legions of Satan to depart the royal vessel. But the exorcism was not merely spiritual. It was a campaign of physical abuse, masquerading as theology. The inquisitors were convinced that the charm that had bewitched the king was a physical object that had been ingested, and thus it had to be expelled. They forced Charles to drink liters of blessed olive oil, mixed with strong purgative herbs and emetics. This was intended to make him vomit out the evil spirits. When the king retched and convulsed on the floor, expelling bile, blood, and stomach lining until he was gasping for air, the monks did not see a man dying of gastrointestinal failure. They saw the devil resisting. They would get on their hands and knees, sifting through the king's vomit with sticks, looking for charms, clumps of hair, fragments of bone, or pieces of corrupted matter that would prove the presence of witchcraft. When they found nothing, they simply poured more oil down his throat. The cruelty escalated into the grotesque. In their desperation, they turned to necromancy. They forced the king to drink water that had been used to wash the relics of saints. In one particularly horrific account, they made him drink water that had been used to wash the corpses of monks in the monastery crypt, believing that the holiness of the dead would neutralize the poison of the living. They were literally feeding the dead to the dying. Under this relentless psychological and physical assault, Charles's mind, which had always been fragile, finally shattered completely. He began to hallucinate vividly. He told the exorcists with wide-eyed, childlike terror that he could feel the witchcraft working inside him physically. "My heart is being eaten," he would whisper to Fray Tenda, clutching his chest. "My kidneys are on fire. My intestines have been tied into knots by the witches of Madrid." He believed that his sterility was caused by a specific spell that had stolen his sperm and replaced it with dust and ashes. He lived in a state of permanent, vibrating panic, seeing demons in the shadows of the tapestries, hearing mocking voices in the wind that rattled the window panes. The man was living in a waking hell, convinced that his own body was a cage of cursed meat that was rotting because God had abandoned him. But the horror was not contained to the king's bedroom. The hysteria metastasized. In a moment of supreme madness, likely manipulated by the exorcists who claimed the answer to the curse lay in the past, or perhaps driven by his own desperate, lonely longing for the only people who had ever loved him, Charles made a decision that chills the blood. He ordered the royal pantheon of the Escorial to be opened. He wanted to see his ancestors. He wanted to look death in the face to ask for forgiveness. This is the scene that defines the Gothic horror of the Habsburg end. It is the moment where the boundary between the living and the dead was erased completely. In the dead of night, the king, shuffling and weeping, supported by his confessors, descended the winding stone stairs into the freezing marble vault where the kings and queens of Spain lay in their eternal sleep. The air in the crypt was chemically cold, smelling of damp stone, ancient dust, and the faint, sweet, sickly scent of decay. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rasping breath of the king and the crackle of the torches held by the trembling monks. By the flickering orange light, Charles ordered the monks to pry open the heavy marble sarcophagi. First, they opened the coffin of his father, Philip IV. The body, preserved by the dry air of the Escorial and the skilled embalmers of the time, was remarkably intact after more than 30 years. Charles stared down at the face of the man who had married his own niece, the architect of this genetic disaster. He looked at the same Habsburg jaw, the same melancholy eyes, the same pale skin. It was like looking into a mirror of his own future. Witnesses report that Charles touched his father's cold, leathery hand and wept, whispering, "Body of my blood, why did you leave me like this?" But the true climax of the horror, the moment that broke him forever, came when he ordered them to open the coffin of his first wife, Marie Louise of Orleans. It had been 10 years since she died. The golden bird was no longer beautiful. The embalming had failed to preserve the softness of her French skin against the ravages of time. What lay in the coffin was a grim visage of death, decayed, withered, the eyes sunken into black hollows, the lips pulled back in a skeletal rictus. But Charles, in the depths of his madness, did not see the rot. He did not see the bone. He saw his Savior. He saw the only human being who had ever looked at him with kindness. He threw himself onto the open coffin. He embraced the decayed corpse, pressing his face against the dusty shroud and the brittle remains of her hair. He wailed, a sound of pure, animalistic despair that echoed off the marble walls of the crypt. My Queen, Marie Louise, wait for me. I am coming to you soon." The monks and courtiers stood back in stunned, horrified silence, watching the King of Spain making love to a corpse. It was the ultimate manifestation of the Habsburg obsession with death. The Ouroboros of the dynasty was finally eating itself. He was trying to crawl into the grave while still alive, to merge his dying body with her dead one. He had to be physically dragged away from her remains, his clothes covered in the grave dust, his hands clutching at the air as they resealed the tomb. When he emerged from the crypt and returned to the upper world of the living, Charles was a changed man. The last thin tether to reality had snapped. He stopped listening to Maria Anna. He stopped listening to the ministers. He stopped trying to rule. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the end. He told his confessor in a moment of terrifying clarity, "My body is not my own. It is a bag of stones. I am already dead. I am just waiting to stop breathing." The great exorcism had failed to drive out the demons because there were no demons to drive out. There were only chromosomes. The witchcraft was not in the air. It was in the blood. The torture of the priests had only accelerated the inevitable. As the year 1700 approached, the biological clock of the Habsburg dynasty ticked its final agonizing seconds. The body of the king, tortured by doctors, abused by priests, starved by genetics, and exhausted by nature, was preparing to shut down. The stage was set for the final revelation, the moment when the doctors would cut him open and find the truth that was far more terrifying than any spell the Inquisition could imagine. As the 17th century drew to its close, the timeline of the Spanish Empire and the biological timeline of its king began to converge toward a single terminal point. The year was 1700. In the rest of Europe, the Enlightenment was beginning to dawn. Science, reason, and philosophy were pushing back the shadows of the medieval world. But in the royal Alcazar of Madrid, time had stopped. The palace was a sealed tomb, trapped in a perpetual twilight of incense, sickness, and superstition. At the center of this darkness lay Charles II, a man who was technically 38 years old, but who possessed the ravaged, disintegrated body of a senile nonagenarian. The Habsburg experiment, the centuries-long attempt to breed a superhuman dynasty, was ending not with a bang, but with a long, agonizing whimper. The physical condition of the king in his final months is difficult to describe without descending into the vocabulary of horror. He was no longer merely sick. He was undergoing a process of total systemic collapse while still conscious. The genetic defects that had plagued him since birth had compounded, creating a cascade of organ failures. His digestion, always weak, had stopped functioning almost entirely. He could not keep down solid food. His meals consisted of breast milk, fed to him by wet nurses, just as in his infancy, and broths made of capons, which he would frequently vomit back up. He was starving to death in a palace filled with gold. His appearance was terrifying. The king was completely bald, his scalp covered in sores, and the remnants of the cradle cap that had never healed. He wore heavy wigs to hide the ruin of his head, but beneath the artificial hair, the skin was angry and inflamed. His teeth, which had never met properly due to his deformed jaw, had rotted and fallen out one by one, leaving his gums blackened and swollen. This made his already garbled speech completely unintelligible. When he tried to speak, only a wet, slurping sound emerged, requiring his confessor to lean his ear against the king's lips to interpret his dying wishes. His hearing was gone. His eyesight was little more than a blur of shadows. He was a prisoner in a sensory isolation tank made of his own failing flesh. But the most agonizing symptom was the dropsy, severe edema caused by kidney and heart failure. His legs and abdomen were swollen with fluid. The skin stretched so tight it looked like parchment ready to burst. His feet were massive, useless blocks of flesh that could no longer support his weight. He spent his days and nights propped up in bed, surrounded by pillows, because lying flat caused the fluid to rush to his lungs and drown him. He was literally suffocating in his own body water. The stench in the royal bedchamber was overpowering, a sickly sweet mix of gangrene, unwashed sweat, vomit, and the heavy cloying perfume of the Catholic rites used to mask the smell of death. The doctors, terrified of being blamed for the death of the monarch, unleashed a final frantic assault of medieval medicine. If the exorcists had tortured his soul, the physicians now tortured his body. They applied blistering agents to his skin, burning him with hot irons and caustic acids in an attempt to draw out the bad humors. They placed freshly killed pigeons on his head, believing that the birds would absorb the fever from his brain. They wrapped his swollen legs in the warm entrails of slaughtered sheep, a primitive dialysis meant to reduce the swelling. These treatments did nothing but add excruciating pain to his final hours. Charles bore it all with a pathetic, childlike resignation. He believed he deserved the pain. He believed it was the price for his failure to produce an heir. Psychologically, Charles was already living in the afterlife. The boundary between the living and the dead had evaporated for him. He spoke to people who were not there. He held long, weeping conversations with his dead mother, Mariana, and his dead wife, Marie-Louise. He told his servants that he could hear them calling him from the crypt of the Escorial. "I am coming," he would whisper into the darkness. "I am not afraid to go. I am afraid to stay." He was a man crushed by the guilt of his own existence. He knew, with a lucid clarity that cut through his dementia, that he was the end of the line. He knew that when he took his last breath, the dynasty of Charles V, the dynasty that had ruled the world, would die with him. He felt the weight of 200 years of history pressing down on his fragile chest, suffocating him. In late October 1700, the end became inevitable. The king fell into a coma, waking only for brief intervals of delirium. The court of Spain froze. The ambassadors of France, Austria, and England stopped their bickering and gathered like vultures, sending hourly dispatches to their masters. "The candle is flickering," they wrote. "The light is almost out." They were not mourning a man. They were waiting for a signal to start the war for his inheritance. Inside the death chamber, the atmosphere was suffocating religious. Cardinal Portocarrero, the Archbishop of Toledo, never left the king's side. He bullied the dying man into signing a final will, naming a successor, manipulating the confused, half-dead monarch until the very last second. Even on his deathbed, Charles was a puppet. On November 1st, 1700, the struggle ended, At 2:45 in the afternoon, the fluid in the king's lungs rose high enough to suffocate him. Charles II stopped breathing. The reaction of the court was immediate and opportunistic. The queen fled to her apartments to steal the jewelry. The ministers rushed to secure their titles. The ambassadors spurred their horses toward Paris and Vienna. The king was dead and the body was left alone on the soiled sheets. Dr. Pedro Fernandez arrived to perform the final duty. He picked up his scalpel and drove it into the chest of the monarch. The incision released clear serum rather than blood. The body was so anemic it had virtually nothing left to give. Inside the rib cage, Fernandez found lungs that were corroded and spongy. The intestines were a gangrenous mass of ulcers. When they sawed open the skull, they found the brain submerged in a pint of water, collapsed under the pressure of hydrocephalus. But the most damning evidence, the physical receipt for 2 centuries of inbreeding, lay in the chest and the groin. The heart was the size of a peppercorn, a withered, calcified knot of muscle. Lower down, the doctor found a single testicle, black as coal and shriveled like a dried prune. This was not just the autopsy of a man, it was the autopsy of a dynasty. The machinery of life had never functioned because the blueprint was broken before he was even born. Dr. Fernandez signed the autopsy report, and with it, the death warrant of the Spanish Empire. As the news spread, the armies of France, Austria, and England crossed the borders. The War of the Spanish Succession tore the territories apart, just as the surgeon had torn apart the king's body. The English took Gibraltar. The Austrians took the Netherlands. The French took the throne. The map of the world was redrawn over the corpse of the last Habsburg. But the true ending of this story does not lie on a battlefield. It lies in the freezing marble silence of the royal crypt of the Escorial. There, in the dark, the circle is finally closed. If you walk through those rows of sarcophagi, you can see the entire tragic arc of the family played out in stone. At one end lies Emperor Charles V, the warrior who conquered the world with iron. At the other end lies Charles II, the invalid who lost the world with biology. Between them lie generations of kings and queens who followed the fatal motto, Tu Felix Austria nube, you, happy Austria, marry. They believed they could cheat nature. They believed that by marrying their own blood, they were building a fortress of purity that would last forever. Instead, they built a genetic prison. They turned the greatest bloodline in Europe into a loop that tightened with every generation until it strangled them. The gold of the Americas, the armies of Flanders, the power of the Inquisition. None of it could save them from the simple, ruthless laws of genetics. In the end, the House of Habsburg was not destroyed by a cannon or a sword. It was destroyed by a wedding ring. The Habsburg jaw remains their eternal signature, not a mark of majesty, but a scar of their own hubris. The line ended here, leaving behind a lesson written in bone. You can conquer the world, but you cannot conquer biology.